Hello everyone, and today we are going to be taking a look at your DMT sound design final project criteria. So let's scroll down and have a look at the exam equivalent project. This is due on the 14th of November, and for this project students are required to create a soundtrack for both the two videos provided. So you can choose one of these videos. They span around about 2 minutes, and you would be able to design various sound effects with the use of music synthesis, as well as implementing Foley sounds, which I will be providing. You could also use your own Foley sounds. And what I mean by Foley sounds is sound effects that you could just import into your project, and you'd be able to place them at specific keyframes. So that's essentially what we're going to be focusing on today, is importing video into Ableton Live, making sure that we disable the warp function so that the frame rate stays the same, and then finding specific key points or keyframes which we will create markers for inside our arrangement view, and then implementing various sound effects through the use of Foley sounds, which we can warp or manipulate in different ways, changing the gain or changing the pitch, as well as creating a basic motif, so a musical idea which would accompany the specific animation. So one of the animations which I'm going to be working with is more of a narrative. This character is exploring the woods, and it's this wooded dark space, and this character is actually in this very ominous area, which I've composed some piano music for, just a basic motif. And the other video is more of a promotional graphically generated animation, which is more synonymous to advertisements and so on. But I'll be focusing on the first video that I've mentioned. So the key elements is to create a basic musical motif that would accompany your sound design elements. Only make use of native Ableton Live synthesizers and audio and MIDI effects. Ensure all key moments have sounds associated with them, sample-based or synthesized. Create track locators with arrangement view to signify keyframes within this project. Be sure that all the arrangement presets generate sonic continuity, display awareness of sound narrative supported by contrast. Do not use the same sounds for different elements of the project. So if you are trying to recycle specific Foley sounds again in other parts of the video which you're scoring for and doing Foley for, be sure to change those duplicate sounds. You could repitch them, you could change the gain, you could reverse them, you can warp them. So explore those elements. You could also process them with different audio effects, which is also quite a diverse subject matter to explore. Make use of multiple effects chains to manipulate and process audio further. Do not rely too heavily on unoriginal samples from external sources. So I will be providing you with a folder of various Foley sounds which you could incorporate in your project. You're also more than welcome to either record your own, or you would be able to find other sound effects online. But that reminds me that because we're working with various moving parts in regards to sound samples, we need to be certain that we are collecting all and saving, so that all the external sound sources we might be using in terms of samples are then collected and saved within the Ableton project, which you'll be sharing with me. So additional vocal instrument recording. In order to complete the sound design production, each student needs to include an original recording within the production. It doesn't need to be a very extravagant recording. You don't need to spend time in the studio at Wits if you don't want to. But the better the quality is, the better the outcome will be, and the less work it will be for you in the long run. So you are more than welcome to make use of the computer labs or to book time at the Wits studio, or if you have access to an external home studio setup, which you could just set up a microphone to either record vocal, record your own Foley sounds, or record any other additional instrumentation which will be accompanying your score. So we also require to have a look at the production and mixing side of things. So essentially approaching your soundtrack, also being sure that we're making use of EQ, compression, all the necessary tools to be able to balance our levels of our musical score, as well as the Foley sounds that you will be adding in addition to the sound design elements that you'll be utilizing with the use of various synthesizers. Okay, so in terms of the submissions, you are going to be providing me with an MP4 bounce along with the Ableton project folder. So that is the entire folder, not just an ALS file, but the entire Ableton project folder, as well as a sound file like a WAV file or an .aiff file for your submission. So 3 different deliverables. So the one would be either an MP4. You could also export an MOV file via Ableton. We'll explore that in our session today. And also making sure that you provide me with the project folder as well as a WAV or a AIFF audio file of your production. Okay, so all submissions must be handed in with the allocated date. So 14 November. Unfortunately, I will not be able to receive any late submissions due to the conversations that I've had with Cameron in regards to grades that need to be submitted and sorted out. So let's have a look at the deliverables. We just spoke about that. So you can actually find within the document the link to the Ulwazi assignments page, where you can actually upload all your content. Be sure to place all of these in one folder. Once you've placed all of the deliverables in one folder, be sure to label it correctly so that I know who you are. As well as we can explore this video link that I've shared with you to show you the process of exporting audio in Ableton Live, as well as exporting video in Ableton Live. So this is the basic setup of the submissions folder. I'm not going to be expanding on this. You could read this document, as well as the sound design assignment brief. So you are able to access these 2 videos and you can select one of them. They span about no longer than 2 minutes. And the approach really is to have a specific musical motif that would accompany the feeling of the video content that you choose to work with. And beyond that, we are going to be talking about creating keyframes, being able to scrub through video using our arrow buttons on our keyboards, and also enabling and disabling the grid so that we are certain that we could find specific keyframes, we can add track locators, and we can start implementing either approaches to sound design or utilizing Foley, or maybe both. These keyframes could also help us in our scoring, being sure that specific musical ideas are happening at specific sections in our video to make sure that the narrative translates correctly. Okay, so the final project requirements, we spoke about our original audio recording. You can obviously find more information in Ulwazi, because we have covered audio recording in the first semester. So you can click the link on that and it would just give you access to the PDF documentation in terms of how to set up an audio interface, how to create the relevant channels, being sure that you are gain staging correctly so that your audio is not too soft or too loud in terms of clipping. As well as an original MIDI recording or sequence. You could make use of various synthesizers. I've just mentioned the analog subtractive synthesizer here because that is what you are comfortable using. We've explored this quite extensively for your sound design project that I've supplied you with a few weeks ago, as well as understanding MIDI sequencing and placement of MIDI events. So you could access this documentation as well via Ulwazi. Incorporating two simpler instruments. In the example that I'm going to be sharing with you, I have taken two vocal improvisations and utilized them to create an original musical sequence that would accompany the narrative for the video. So you can explore implementing various rhythmic elements or melodic or harmonic elements, but the idea really is that you make use of the tools provided within the simpler instrument to create movement through modulation, to create movement through the amplitude ADSR, to create movement through filtering possibilities, as well as additional audio effects or MIDI effects that you would like to incorporate. So explore the simpler device and utilize it either in slice mode, in the original one-shot mode, or in the classic mode, which would allow you to loop playback if you want to implement that. So showcasing the behr rack, a few weeks ago, we also built an original polyphonic instrument rack by utilizing separate one-shot samples of the behr. And we are going to be implementing this instrument in the video. So I would like you to showcase the behr polyphonic rack, and you have the ability to select the note range. You can use it as an effect. You could also use it to accompany your musical motif. It is completely up to you how you use this rack, but I will show you how I've incorporated it in my example for you. You could also click on this link over here to actually access the assignment so that you are aware of the fact that there are various ways to actually approach this instrument and not just have it sound like an organic acoustic instrument. You could also completely manipulate it through the tools provided within the sampler, which allows you to also loop audio, to work with the ADSR, to work with filtering, to work with additional frequency modulation oscillators, and so on. So you could shape the sound as you see fit. Including a drum rack. So this drum rack can house samples. They don't necessarily need to be percussion one-shot samples. It completely just needs to provide additional accompaniment either through the sound design elements, maybe sound effects can be loaded into a drum rack, that would be triggered via MIDI note messages, or you could include the drum rack in a more traditional sense by implementing it as an additional percussion source or rhythmic element within your score. So it's completely up to you how you include your drum rack. So adding additional audio effects. Reverb needs to be implemented. Delay or echo needs to be implemented. Definitely EQ8 on every single track that you have inside your project, as well as making use of compressors so that we are lessening the dynamic range, so that the quiet elements of your composition or sound design and the loudest elements of your sound design or composition is not too great a distance in terms of the amount of dBs that we are producing, which means we will lessen the dynamic range by implementing a compressor, by bringing down the threshold, as well as utilizing the makeup gain, the attack time, the release time, and so on. So we could also make use of a glue compressor inside your master track just to get all the various elements sonically to actually coincide with one another. But you could also review what we've covered in regards to audio effects on these links below. Okay, so also an additional element which is so important to this project is implementing automation. Automation basically means that any device parameter that we select will be utilized through passage of time to create movement or motion. So it's very important to implement automation through various keyframes, so that when certain happenings are being created, or happening in your particular video that you've selected, that you select a certain device parameter. This device parameter could be the cutoff frequency of the filter, for example, to open up through a period of time to create a specific effect. Or let's say your character is running off into the distance and you are making use of, let's say, automating the volume of that particular channel so that your Foley fades out in the background. Everything that we are doing, we are trying to serve the provided video content, and by utilizing automation to make changes through passage of time, it allows us to create a more immersive soundscape. So it's very important to implement automation. And if you think about all the various ways that we can implement automation in terms of track parameters, panning, so things moving from the left to the right, for example, we can think about filters, we can think about the volume, we could also think about changing the attack time of an amplifier ADSR. We can create so many diverse elements and movement through the use of automation, which is so important in this project. So please pay attention to implementing automation when you are ready. So production synthesis techniques, everything that we've covered in regards to subtractive synthesis, your sound design project that you've done where you were provided with audio clips of various sounds that we've generated with the analog subtractive synthesizer, all of these elements will now come into play with your chosen video that you would like to work with. So showcase your understanding of the use of the subtractive synthesizer. We will be covering wavetable synthesis as well as frequency modulation, also known as FM synthesis, in the next 2 lectures. But essentially provide me with various interesting sounds that you've generated either to accompany your musical score or your various special effect sounds that you can implement during the course of your video production composition. So key elements we have covered, as well as production and mixing we have covered, production techniques. So production techniques we will be covering today is obviously time compression and expansion through warping audio. So very, very important that we actually place emphasis on the idea that we can set keyframes to specific parts of our composition to implement either Foley or specific events in our musical motif. And we can utilize audio clips with warping enabled to compress or expand our particular piece of audio that we're working with so that it is in alignment or in sync with what is happening in your video. So warping audio is very important. Equalization techniques including comb filtering for resonance, subtractive EQ is very, very important. You will find that a lot of these Foley sounds or found sounds generate quite a lot of high and low frequency content that we might not necessarily need. So subtractive EQ is a good practice to clean up any residual low end or high end frequencies or any frequencies which might be cumbersome to your overall mix. Compression tools we've discussed, the use of reverb and delay. So if we think about providing an ambient textural quality to a video animation, it is very important for us to take into consideration that, for example, our character might be in a specific space which might have specific acoustic qualities. So therefore, implementing reverb and delay to create a 3-dimensional mix technique to place our characters in the space or this environment is absolutely important. So the use of delay we can use as a special effect with the use of feedback, or with the use of changing the delay time as we're passing audio through it, or with the use of reverb to create a cavernous space, or a space with a natural ambience around it, so that our Foley sounds that we place with this type of processing does not sound too dry. So it's also important not to have too much delay or reverb on our signal. So we want to create a space that is inviting or enveloping or immersive. So very, very important to take that into consideration. So we obviously want to balance our levels. So if we think about our background music or musical motif, as well as our Foley sounds, as well as our sound design elements through the use of synthesizers, we want to be certain that we are balancing the levels of all of these various moving parts. And we could utilize that obviously through compression, but also balancing the actual volume faders on the channels themselves, or within the audio clips, for example. So we could change the gain from the audio clips perspective, but we could also implement sidechain compression if need be to actually create a hierarchy. For example, let's say my character's voice needs to be the focal point of a specific scene in our video. Then obviously all the other elements, including the music, need to actually create space or headroom for our character's vocalization to be clear and concise. So therefore we can implement sidechain compression in that example. You would be able to read more up on sidechain compression on the audio effects link that I've mentioned earlier. But essentially sidechain compression can help us to create more space if there is quite a lot of density in your mix to create a hierarchy. So all of the other elements in terms of automation and modulation we've discussed, as well as the various synthesizers. We can read a little bit more about all of these different elements, but these are the synthesizers that we are going to be implementing for the project. So without further ado, I will take us now to the Ableton project example that I have for you. But before I get started with that, I just want to show you how we import video into Ableton. So I'm going to head over to Ableton quickly and just grab our sound design video that I'm going to be bringing into my Ableton project. So let me head over. And here we are. Let me just start a new live set. And we have our Ableton live set, and obviously we're not going to be working within Session View. Session View allows us a lot of flexibility in terms of creating loops and all sorts of interesting things for live performance. But seeing as we're working with a fixed timeline because we're working with video, let's head over to Arrangement View. So we could either click on this icon on the right-hand side, the horizontal lines, or I could press the Tab button. And we are in Arrangement View. I'm going to minimize this so that I can drag from my desktop, which you won't be able to see now, but I would be able to actually drag in my MOV file or MP4 file into either a MIDI track or an audio track. So let me just drop it here. I could drop it anywhere and slide it over to the first marker at the timeline. But you would actually see that a video window appears. And now with this video window, we can actually play back video. We could resize our video as well. And to be 100% certain that we are not adjusting the frame rate by means of warping inside Ableton, we need to double click to see the clip view, so that we can be sure that warping has been disabled. You can see that it's grayed out over here. What warping will do, if it is enabled by mistake, is going to be adjusting the frame rate, the natural frame rate of the exported video, which we brought into Ableton Live now. So we are going to keep this as unwarped so that we retain the frame rate of the video. So a very important thing that we need to discuss now is we can obviously either start with a musical motif or we can start just creating some various keyframes. But let's have a quick look at the video and then we can take it from there. So I'm going to play this back and we can quickly watch this together. It's only 2 minutes, so it's not going to take too long. So this character is walking through the woods and busy, investigating this very ominous environment. And she discovers a strange structure in the distance. And she hears a rustling in the trees, some rocks falling. And then all of a sudden, this tree stump appears to be a foot of a creature. So this creature is absolutely enormous, and you can see the branches breaking, and this creature is descending from way up there. And you can actually think about or start hearing some sound design elements that you could employ for this project. It has these massive fern-like tentacles, which will employ the behr to actually play on, but we can already think about what the music will be doing, what this narrative is actually telling us, and that's the most important thing. Follow the cue points of the video to actually guide you through the process. So now she realizes that this creature is not, ill in its nature, so it's not, going to eat her or anything like that. And she befriends this creature, and this creature gives her one of its leaves. And then all of a sudden, she puts it in her staff, and she strikes the staff on the ground. So you can think about all the various elements that we can implement in regards to sound design possibilities, as well as musical ideas for our motif. Okay, so let's talk about keyframes. So first of all, we've placed this on the first beat. Just to be certain, I've dragged and dropped this video right there on the timeline, and I'm not splitting this video. This video is completely in one piece, so you could possibly by mistake, split this and, have a problem where you're editing the video by mistake. Be certain not to do that so that the timeline remains exactly the same. And I'm actually stretching the left-hand side out all the way through here until the end of the video, which you can see over here. So at this point in time, we can also take into consideration the grid. The grid is now enabled to a 1-bar subdivision. You can see 1/1. So that means we are moving by a particular bar. Now, before we start creating keyframes over here, think about your BPM of your motif, because you want this BPM to actually remain the same throughout your entire composition. That means that we don't necessarily have to use the grid to compose, but if we pick a BPM that we know our original motif or our basic predominant motif in our project will remain, then it's going to be easier for us to create duplicates or copy or edit or take a specific 4-bar instance and edit that or change that over. So pick a BPM for your musical motif before you move on and insert specific keyframes. So for example, I'm just going to say that my motif will be 80 BPM. I've changed this, and you can see things have now adjusted accordingly. And the frame rate's not changed based on the fact that this is not warped in the video, but now we can see that we've got an 80 BPM layout over here for our composition. So that's just going to be for our musical ideas. We could obviously access our metronome as a cue point so that we know what's happening. But now we can move on to creating specific keyframes, and then I will move on to my example that I would share with you, and that will be investigating all the techniques that we've discovered or discussed in the brief earlier. So the most important thing is obviously we can click around and see that the various keyframes or frames are changing in the video and the timeline. And unfortunately, this resolution is far too coarse to find specific points that of interest that we need to actually take note of. And these points of interest are keyframes. So what I would like to do is I'm going to actually disable the grid by right-clicking anywhere in the region, and I'm going to go to the fixed grid section and switch it off. The hotkey for this is Command or Control 4 to enable and disable the grid. This is very useful when we are working with our Foley sounds or our sound design elements or generating specific markers within our arrangement view that we will be adding sound design elements or Foley to. We could always re-enable the grid when we are working with our musical motif if you so choose. So I'm going to switch the grid off, and now you can see that these are dotted lines, and we can now freely click and drag to scrub the audio frames. Now, first of all, I'm going to have a look at my very first section over here, and I'm going to scrub very gently, and you can see this is all black screen until we reach about this point, where you can see the clouds are clearing, and then we have a look at a bird's nest. So I'm going to take it from around here, and that is where I would like to place my first sound. So the music can possibly start earlier with the black screen, but our first Foley sound can actually be placed here. So once I've actually created this pinpoint by just clicking and not dragging, just a single click to provide us with a single frame, we would be able to right click at the top when you see the speaker icon. So not around here and not around here, but when you see the speaker icon, I can now right click and create a locator. And now I'm going to say fade in, or whatever type of locator name you would like. And that fade in can now be provided with a specific sound design element. I've got a MIDI track over here that's empty currently. I'm going to be making use of an analog subtractive synthesizer to generate my first sound. So I'm going to click here and drag until I find that the actual bird's nest is now in sight, where I think the sound design element can subside. So now I've got the start and end point because I clicked from that first marker that I've created all the way to that specific keyframe where I see that the bird's nest is in full view. So what I'm going to do now with the selection is right click, and I'm going to go to insert empty MIDI clips over here. Now the hotkey for that is Shift Command M, and I can click on that, and now I've got an entire MIDI clip region that is completely the length from that first marker till the other keyframe that I've allocated. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my browser, and I'm going to go to my instruments, and I'm going to grab an analog synthesizer. The reason why I've got the analog synthesizer for this project is I'm going to make use of the noise oscillator so that I could actually create a special effect to actually accompany this particular frame. So I'm going to create a MIDI clip region by clicking and dragging, and I'm going to drag it throughout the entire range of that clip that I've created. Now, you'll also bear in mind that in our clip view, once we've created this MIDI clip region in our arrangement, you can see that we also have a grid within our clip view. You'll find this in MIDI clips as well as audio clips. And the biggest problem with this is the grid is enabled again, which means it's going to be very difficult to edit the length of this note based on the fact that it's trying to snap to a 16th note grid subdivision. So I'm going to right click and disable the grid in my clip view as well. That means that I can now freely drag this, and I'm going to extend this throughout the entire length of that particular part. Now I've got my white noise oscillator that I've selected over here. We can change the color of the noise. That's almost this very similar type of processing as filtering. The lower the actual range over here, the darker the sound, the higher the range of this color dial, the brighter the sound. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be making use of my low pass filter, which the noise oscillator is routed to. You can see that it is routed to F1, which is filter 1, which has been enabled. I've disabled the other two oscillators, and we can implement some automation for the filter frequency to create a whooshing effect, almost like we're traveling through the clouds from the darkness to our first keyframe, which will be our nest over here. So another element that I would like to also address is the amplitude attack time. Based on the fact that the amplitude attack time is now set to 5 milliseconds, the moment the MIDI note is triggered, the white noise will be playing. So let's listen to what the sound's like. It's not going to sound like much. So just a light white noise sound, which we could obviously automate through the use of the filter frequency. But let's just have a look at the amplitude attack time first. I'm going to fade this in to accompany our frames. And I'm going to be pushing this back quite... There we go. The length of the note is a little bit long, so I'm going to be bringing this back a little bit. And what I would like to do as well is I'm going to implement the release time of my amplitude envelope over here so that it gently fades out. I'm also going to be bringing up the sustain so that it's exactly the same value as the decay. There we go. And now what we can do is we can start thinking about our automation of our low pass filter. So let's click on the filter frequency. That's the cut off frequency of my low pass filter. And I would like to view the automations that I could draw in some automation information. So right click on the filter frequency, show automation, and then I can create 2 breakpoints. One breakpoint is going to be the maximum value. I can adjust this later on. Remember, we can resize our window over here so that we can clearly view our automation lane, and I can create my second breakpoint and, you know, have it start at 30 Hertz. So that's a little bit aggressive due to the fact that we have a linear movement from this point to this point. And we can also create curved shapes, as we've learned through our investigation in automation data and how we implement automation data on Ulwazi. I've set up a link that you can access, but let's create a curved shape by hovering over the line and pressing the Alt button on our keyboard. And then you can actually see that there's a curved based icon that indicates to us if we keep this button held in and we click and drag down, we can create a logarithmic curve, or we can create a curve that is bell-shaped like this if we drag upwards. So we can decide what the best approach would be based on the video footage. So that's a little bit aggressive. Let's try the other way. Let's also take the maximum value and bring that down. So we also need to take into consideration that there is an envelope on our filter frequency present, which is also generating this movement. And I'm going to disable my envelope for my filter frequency. So I selected 0, as a value instead of 4, and now we are not going to be implementing additional modulation through our filter envelope. You are more than welcome to explore this if you want to, but I'm just going to be keeping this fairly simple. There we go. Now we've got a little bit more control. Now we can adjust the output. There we go. It feels like we're traveling through the clouds, and then we can start thinking about how we can actually revise this through audio effects processing, such as the EQ8. Let's have a look at the range of signals. So you can see there's a lot of low frequency content that we don't need. So I'm going to create a high pass filter. I'm just going to cut around about 70 Hertz. You could also type in your values over here, and I'm also going to be doing the same thing with the higher frequencies. So let's say around about 10,000. There we go. So now we've created a nice subtractive EQ range in terms of our effect, and we have the ability to now take this further by implementing a reverb. So let's type in reverb in our browser. And let's also process this ever so slightly. I'm going to be cutting the low frequency content over here, as well as, so this is the input section of our reverb. So we are applying filtering before the actual reverb is taking place. So this is still the dry sound being filtered, so that we are 100% certain that we are not importing or routing any low frequency content that we don't need into the reverb algorithm over here. So I'm going to be creating a little bit of higher frequencies over here. So this is obviously the filtering of what would be reverberated, what we'll be hearing. So it's very important for us to actually place this in the right frequency range. So always be aware of that when you're working with your reverb. Now I'm going to be placing the dry wet around about 45%, and let's hear what this sounds like. So it's a lot more subtle based on the fact that we have a bit of a decay time, and it's just going to allow us a more gentle introduction as opposed to very harsh sound. So you need to decide how dry or how wet your specific sounds would be that you are creating in regards to the use of reverb or other additional audio effects. Now, we could also implement some really interesting techniques by widening the stereo of this particular effect by implementing a utility. So I'm typing in utility, and I'm going to be placing this before the reverb. You can decide on the order of effects, but I would always recommend after any kind of synthesizer, place an EQ and then do your additional processing as you see fit. So with our utility, we could actually implement a stereo image by changing the amount of width beyond 100%. So I'm going to be pushing this a little bit further to create a wider stereo spread. So let's bring this up in volume a little bit. There we go. So we are on our way to actually generating an immersive textural element. Now we could obviously control the dynamic range by implementing a compressor at the end of the signal chain. So I can just find a compressor and place it next to or after the reverb. And I'm going to bring the threshold down until I get to control the dynamic range, and I can dial in the attack and the release as I see fit. I'm not going to be spending too much time on the compressor now, but you get the idea. Now we've processed the audio by EQing. We've also implemented a specific sound to be generated with our synthesizer. Remember, we could also automate any of these other additional device parameters if we see fit. You could automate the volume if you wanted to. We can add in an additional LFO to create more motion in terms of the filter cutoff frequency. So for example, I can use my LFO over here, and then I can go back to my filter And I could say I would like to use LFO1 to create a little bit of motion in terms of the filter cutoff. So let's make this quite apparent for this example. I'm going to create a slower rate at which the LFO will be oscillating. So you can hear additional motion so that we are not working with a very linear sound anymore. And if I change the rate, you'll actually be able to hear it audibly. Now that's a little bit too aggressive, but you get the idea. So implement automation and modulation in conjunction to similar device parameters or the same device parameters to create additional motion. Remember, we are creating an immersive environment here. So that takes us to the point where we will be working with sound design elements. So I'm just going to be locating a folder very briefly that I've got a couple of sound effects on. I've got some creature footsteps here that I'm just bringing in. So I've got a whole bunch of creature footsteps that we can implement on an audio track, and we'll find a keyframe for it. So I'm just going to go out of my automation view. That's this little button over here. And we will find a point at which the creature is moving. So at that keyframe over there, I'm going to be creating a marker. So another way that we could scrub through the audio is I've selected a point and I'm going to use my arrow buttons. Because the grid is disabled, I can now use my right and left arrow buttons to either move forward in the timeline very slowly or to move back. So now I can move back a little bit and press the arrow button once to the right, and now I've exactly found that keyframe that I require for the sound effect to be implemented. So I'm going to right click, add a locator, and I'm going to call this stomp or whatever meaningful name you want. And now also another thing that I would like to do just before we move on is remember these tracks are just going to be entitled analog or wavetable or whatever the case may be. Make it a meaningful name. Give it a meaningful name so that you know what this is actually doing, what type of sound this is providing. Let's expand this and let's rename this very quickly. I'm just going to be calling this whoosh. Or you can call it whoosh noise or white noise, so that you know exactly what this does. You know, don't get confused when you've got a whole bunch of tracks are either entitled audio or analog or wavetable. You know, we could also rename this SDO1 video so that you know that you don't have to mess with this or edit this. Okay, so let's bring in our creature footstep. I'm just running off the top of my head here, but I've got the sound sample that I'm going to be dragging into an audio track. So let's call this stomp. And you could also rename your clips if you want. So that's also very useful because then you know exactly what this does. This does say creature footstep, but just in case you're working with audio clips that have no identifiable or recognizable name in terms of what it provides us with. So this is our keyframe. This is where the foot is stomping on the ground really hard, and you can actually see that our transient, if we're analyzing the sound wave, and we could obviously expand this by clicking and dragging, you can see that this is actually where the point of impact is at its loudest. You know, we're looking at the amplitude here, and this is obviously the loudest point of impact. So it's good for us to actually align that loudest point of impact to the actual stomp itself. So I'm going to click and drag back to align this. We could fade this in. You know, you can see I can grab this little box over here to create a fade in effect. And then I'm going to bring the volume down and let's hear what we've got and how it actually coincides with our sound. There we go. So now we've placed our stomp sample in time. I'm just going to bring it up in volume. So there we go. We've placed our audio sample correctly and we've given it a meaningful name. And now we are starting to actually look at the difference between working with Foley audio samples, which we've worked with here. Just to reiterate what we can do with the sound, let's say the sound was a little bit too short in its decay time. I can enable warping. We've got a warp marker over here, and I can disable the grid by right-clicking. Let's disable the grid over here. And then I can create another breakpoint or warp marker, and I can click and drag to expand the length of the sound or the tail end or decay time of the amplitude to create maybe a bigger stomping sound. There we go. Now, you could also hear ever so slightly that additional artifacts are being implemented because we've enabled warp mode. So once you start warping audio by extracting, expanding, or compressing the length of the samples, that is a destructive way of working, which means it's going to be possibly causing the sound not to sound as natural or as good a quality as we started off with. And that's why it's important for us not to stretch or compress the samples that we're working with too much. But we can also implement different warping algorithms to try and alleviate this problem. So I'm going to be making use of Complex Pro, which I would definitely recommend because we have additional filtering capabilities once we've selected that. So I can change my formant filtering and my envelope to make it more of a natural sound. And you can also hear the extra debris that's falling within the sound sample is a little bit more accentuated. So that helps us in terms of providing an immersive sound by utilizing warping. Now, we could take some of these tools that we've, audio effects that we've used over here, and I can simply select all of them by clicking on my EQ8 and selecting my compressor, pressing Command-C to copy this, and I'm just going to be placing this as just a standard template of audio processing tools that we could implement in our found sound or Foley sound. So I'm going to make it less wide. I'm also going to be introducing a little bit lower frequency content, so I'm going to push this back down to 30 hertz. We could obviously make changes later on. I'm going to keep the low pass filter at the same amount, and I'm also going to be bringing the dry wet quality a little bit less, about 33%. I think the compression is okay. I'm just going to adjust the threshold ever so slightly. And there we go. We've now created more reverberation, a little bit of a wider stereo image. We're controlling the overall frequency content by attenuating the low and the high frequencies, as well as compressing the dynamic range of our samples. So now we've got this template in place, it is time for us to actually talk about housekeeping. Now, sometimes you're going to be implementing multiple samples in this project on top of one another, or one particular keyframe that we've pinpointed, and therefore you require additional audio tracks, which you could obviously easily create by right-clicking, inserting audio tracks. But essentially, and eventually, you will be ending up with a whole bunch of MIDI tracks and a whole bunch of audio tracks, not just for your Foley sounds, but also for the sound design elements through the use of synthesizers and additional musical accompaniment. And it's very important for us to start thinking about housekeeping. So labeling tracks is very important, but in addition to this, it's also good for us to start thinking about our sound design elements as being grouped by right-clicking, grouping our track into our sound design or music synthesis elements, you know. So this will be all the synthesizers we use to create white noise or to create interesting sound effects and so on. So I'm going to be calling this music synthesizers or music synthesis. And we could also place additional, MIDI clips within here. So you could create a musical idea and then place obviously all the musical ideas for your accompaniment, the actual harmonic and melodic content in their own respective group tracks. So this will only be for effects. So let's rename this rather to sound design effects. That makes a little bit more sense in terms of what we're doing here. So I could compress this, and I'm going to do the same thing over here. And the hotkey in terms of grouping, let's say, all of these audio tracks together, I'm selecting them by using Shift. I can press Command or Control G, and that is the same thing as right-clicking and selecting Group. So let's call this Foley Sounds. And that would be all the special effect sounds like stomps, breathing, the wind blowing, and so on, and all of these various elements. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to head over to my Ableton project that I've spent about a day working on a musical motif, as well as sound design elements and Foley sound placement. Just to run you through what it sounds like and also investigate some of the other device parameters that we've explored and that we could actually have a look at. So I'm going to go and grab this. I'm not going to save this project because I've got one already open. So let's just wait for this to load, and then we'll take it from there. So here we are. Here is my video. I'm going to expand this and let's watch it from the beginning. Let me also make this full screen so we don't have to look at my taskbar. And you can actually see I'm going to hover around here and you can see a whole bunch of keyframes. Here's a tree that's breaking. So that's the tree that's breaking. Here's another tree branch that's breaking. It's obviously the legs of the creature. That's the creature descending. This is the air that's flowing from, the steam that's coming out of the creature's mouth over there, which we could obviously also utilize sound design elements to. Here is another bellowing steam section. Breathing of the character. This is very, very slight. But you could see all of these keyframes are here. And obviously I'm not 100% done with this project. I haven't actually mixed or mastered it. But this is going to give you a very good indication of how we actually go about this. All these keyframes are helping us. But I've already allocated my motif's BPM, which I've obviously composed at the top over here. So here's my piano. And this is also accompanied with a pizzicato string. So I've just made use of duplicates of the piano motif that I've sequenced over here and just made duplicates to actually create the accompaniment. But let's listen to this and watch this video, and then I will just pinpoint a couple of other elements that we will explore. Okay, so let me be sure that everything is ready, and let's play this and have a look at the video and the sound design. And there we go. So let's explore what we've done here. And first of all, you can see that I implemented the whooshing sound at the top over here with some automation. So the automation is on the panning over here, but this is staying central for this introduction. And we've also implemented additional automation of the filter frequency. I've also made use of an auto filter plugin to create two risers in the automation. So this one obviously has more of a logarithmic curve, and this one is more of a linear curve. So I've also brought the color down to make it a little bit more darkened in the timbral quality of the sound. Let's have a look. But there's also an additional element implemented here, which is this whoosh sound that I've brought in, just to give it more of a dreamlike type of texture. So you could hear the higher frequencies over here. I've also not processed this yet, but I've placed a multiband compressor as well as our standard EQ8 with the low pass and high pass filtering able to control the actual frequency range of the sound. So this is a combination of this effect as well as this effect. Now obviously my piano motif is in the middle of nowhere. I would definitely recommend cleaning this up a little bit more. We've got our two simpler devices that house nothing at the moment. I can delete that for the time being. But we have a whole bunch of other sound effects. So I'm going to be placing my piano motif at the bottom. And I just want to be certain that I have not... let me just undo this. Give me a sec. And I'm going to place my piano motif not in my Foley sounds. So I'm going to move my Foley sounds up. And I'm going to be placing this in my sound design elements. So let's just call this effects sound design. So obviously you're constantly going to have to be certain that the housekeeping element of the project is constantly going to have to be revisited to be certain that you're placing everything once you've actually processed it correctly, once you've actually placed the sounds correctly and did the sound design. It's always good to actually say, okay, well, these are my Foley sounds. This is all audio content, so I can actually call it Foley sounds audio. And this white noise is obviously a MIDI instrument providing us with the sound design effect. So I can place that actually in here. So let's have a look at some other elements. So I've created another keyframe here called Frost. Let's have a look and see what is inside our Foley Sounds folder. I've got some vinyl crackle to signify the frost on this particular plant over here, just to give a more immersive type of interaction. You know, I've also taken a sample of an ice tray that is crackling as the ice is busy melting, just to give you an idea. So it's a combination of the vinyl crackle. Let's solo this. Very, very slight crackling to just accompany that frame. Let's have a listen to the ice melting. So additional high frequency content, and once we combine these two elements, then we can actually hear the entire sequence actually taking place. Now I'm fading this out, seeing as you can see that the focus is pulling away from this particular branch or this plant to our protagonist, which is walking on this pathway in this woodland area. So I am actually diverting our attention also by fading these samples out so that we can actually place emphasis on what's happening over there. Now obviously we've got our sound accompaniment or the musical motif. We have some footsteps over here. Oh, these footsteps are really soft. I can bring them up a little bit by bringing up the gain. You could also see that I've taken these same footstep samples and I've actually split them. And how we do this is we can select the region just by clicking here, right click and select split. The hotkey for this is Command E. That would split these two, and then I can process, let's say, the gain of this particular clip differently to the rest of the audio in this particular clip. So that's what I've done over here. You can see that the gain is much higher. I've also repitched this by 12 semitones down just to create a larger sound, a lower frequency sound. And it's very important for us to actually find these keyframes. You know, you could see I haven't actually created keyframe markers, which would also be quite beneficial, but it's also good for us to actually talk about that we could actually do our alignment of our transients inside clip view when we're working with audio Foley sounds, right? So if I expand this view by clicking and dragging, I can now pinpoint a particular transient by hovering over, and you could see Ableton's already analyzed this audio for us, saying that this is a point of impact. This is where the amount of amplitude changes drastically, which is known as a transient, which we can now double click to create a marker. So now that I've got this marker created, you can also see that I've disabled the grid in my clip view, and that's going to allow me to take this marker and move it freely to actually pinpoint. She's going to be placing her staff on the ground a little bit further back, and let's actually see. That's the actual point over here. So let's grab this and let's find that keyframe. I'm going to zoom out a little bit so that we could do this a little bit quicker. And you can see I've actually aligned this quite properly, but I'm going to expand the length of this clip just for this example so that I could find that particular frame. I'm going to do this a little bit more. You can see if I'm moving this warp marker freely, I could see the keyframe as the character is placing the staff on the ground and then pinpoint it exactly as a keyframe right there. And then I can easily just fade this in and truncate the sample a little bit. This can also fade out because I'm just interested in this particular point of impact, that transient. Let me solo this and let's hear what this sounds like in conjunction with our video. And now obviously we have the ability to make this more immersive by implementing reverb again. So reverb. And we could also explore our various presets in here. And you could do this with the synthesizers as well. So very important to actually explore these presets as a starting point so that you don't always have to dial everything in. So a space. Let's have a look and see if there's something that can work. So let's try the cold room as an example. So you can hear there's a lot more character to the sound based on the fact that we've placed this in our track. And we can process either all of our sounds together in the group track with the same reverb, or you can actually do that for separate samples. It really depends on how you would like to work. But just be aware of the fact that because this is in a group track, I can head over to the group track and place, let's say, a reverb. I've placed a compressor on here. I'm also probably going to be placing a regular compressor in this track, just so that we can control the dynamic range of that sound effect as well. So let's double click and create a standard compressor, bring down the threshold, and then we can actually listen to this more clearly based on the fact that we have some makeup gain, we've got the threshold dialed in, and you could also dial in the attack time and the release time. There we go. So that's a lot louder. We can obviously balance it back in the background. And there we go. So now we have successfully placed the sample, and now we can see that in the scene there's a keyframe that says look up. This is obviously where our camera is panning toward the skies to view this ominous creature, and you can see it's slightly off in terms of where my marker was. That's not a problem. We can shift this up and place this in alignment. So be certain that if I'm clicking here, you can see that the frame's not changing based on the fact that we've made a selection on the timeline already. So that's what we're looking at in the video. So don't get confused moving this cue marker around and thinking that our frames are supposed to be changing. So we're going to align this properly so that we know that if I press my back arrow button, once I click here, press my back arrow button, we find our particular keyframe. So I'm actually slightly off still. So let's move back until it gets updated. For some reason, it skipped forward quite a bit. So it's important for us to actually pinpoint this correctly. There we go. So I'm going to place this exactly on there. And then for this particular scene, I've got a windstorm sample that is a little bit higher than the original sample that I've actually brought in. So I split this clip and then did a basic crossfade to create a louder interpretation of the same sampled content or Foley content, just to create that change in the camera view. So let's listen to what's happening with the wind sample. Very slight. And then you could hear that this is a lot more apparent. And we could crossfade this a little bit more gently. Move this over. And then we can change the gain even a little bit more to make it a little bit more immersive as we're moving from the one camera angle to the next. So that's how I approach this. And you can obviously also see that this particular scene where dirt is falling down, I'm just scrubbing over here, I've implemented a sample for that, which is entitled Dirt, and we could listen to this. Now, same story over here. I've obviously warped the sample a little bit to expand it, and you can hear it sounds a little bit questionable in terms of the quality of the sound. So I can address this by utilizing the Complex Pro Warp mode. And now you can hear that we're getting a lot more higher frequency content, and we could adjust the filtering, over here, as well as the envelope. I'm going to bring this down. And that's a little bit more immersive. We could also do the same thing here, implement a little bit of reverb. And this time I'm going to go for empty auditorium. Let's see what that sounds like. Also going to make sure that we are not putting this at 100% wet. I'm going to be, just dialing it back a little bit. So that's a little bit exaggerated. So the size could be a little bit smaller. The decay time could be a bit smaller. Let's remove a little bit of the low frequency content. There we go. So that's already giving us a lot more of an immersive quality. Now this is to the left side of the character, and if we really wanted to, we could possibly create some automation to implement this to be directed more to the left-hand side of the screen. So Once we do that, we need to be aware of the fact that other samples reside in this project. So this vinyl crackle, for example, perhaps I don't want this particular reverb to come through and affect the vinyl crackle too much. So let's address that first. I'm going to click on my dry wet of my reverb that I've imported into this track. And I'm going to lessen the amount of reverb right there, let's say to 4.5. That rises to 25% over here. And I'm going to be having a look at the other samples. This is okay. This is still kind of in a larger area, which means the reverb would probably work well in those particular instances. So let's address the panning that we've discussed. Character is in the middle. The sound is on the left-hand side a little bit to our perspective, which means we can now create breakpoints. And we can shift this over a little bit to the left-hand side, let's say about 16%. We could also hover over these breakpoints and right-click to edit the value. So if I say minus 20, then minus is obviously moving toward the left-hand side, so that's the left speaker. Let's edit the value over here to minus 20 as well. And now we'll be able to hear the sounds being generated to the left side of the layout in terms of creating more of an immersive sound. So let's talk about synthesis a little bit. We've now discussed warping our audio, expanding our audio using various warp modes. And you're not always bound to use warp modes with samples. You could obviously disable the warp function, but then you won't be able to implement really drastic transitions in terms of working with your audio content. So warping always helps us to really expand the capabilities through extracting or compressing or expanding our audio, as well as repitching our audio. Okay, let's have a look at synthesis elements. Get out of automation mode, and let's have a look at our sound design group track over here, and let's have a look at our alien sound. So the moment the character stomps the ground, or the moment the character is actually like busy moving, and then eventually the tree trunk actually is revealed as a foot of a creature, then we have the ability to implement some sound design elements. So what I've done here is it's kind of an alien sound, which works with a wavetable synthesizer. I can unfreeze this. I've just frozen this so that I can always move back and forth without having to generate the sound from scratch every single time. I'll explain this in more detail, but effectively this wavetable synthesizer allows us to create a morphing wave shape. You can see that we've got a sawtooth wave over here, which morphs into a finer quad sawtooth wave over here. So effectively, a wavetable synthesizer works with single cycle sampled waveforms. So this is a sample. I can take any audio sample and drop it into this window, and the wavetable synthesizer will analyze a single portion of our sample and then create an oscillator waveform. Like we've explored with subtractive synthesis, working with sine waves, sawtooth waves, all the basic waveforms, a wavetable synthesizer can work with more complex waveform shapes that we could extract from sound samples. So I can record my voice, for example, and drop it into this window, and then it would take a single cycle of my sample and then implement that as the oscillator wave shape, which we would be able to scrub to morph between various states of that particular sample. So you can see this is a basic sawtooth, which then turns into a more complex quad sawtooth wave. So let's listen to this alien sound, and then we'll discuss this further. So the character is now obviously completely startled by this movement and will be very frightened once the tree trunk turns into a foot. Okay, doesn't sound like much at this point in time, but with our accompaniment, this actually pitch shifts to a major third interval based on the fact that the character is startled by this creature, not knowing whether this creature has some kind of ill intent or not, but eventually realizes that this creature is just descending to actually communicate with her. So effectively, I've created the sound with a single MIDI note. And we'll look at the MIDI layout over here. This is obviously in key to our motif, as well as implementing some modulation of device parameters. So you'll hear the pitch shifting taking place, and that is the modulation wheel that I've accessed. And you can see a very similar icon over here. This tab signifies that we could actually implement creating envelopes to generate modulation of particular device parameters. Now I'm interested in modulating the pitch. So if I click on here, you can actually see that I have my envelopes view, and I'm going to click and go to MIDI control. You can see I've already created information in the MIDI control region. And this is my pitch bend device parameter that I've now drawn in. So this is now staying steady at 0, which means we are not affecting the pitch yet. But then all of a sudden, when the character stomps down, boom, then the pitch is moving up and then down to the actual motion. We could dial this in even more once the character is lifting its foot up, which will be around about here. So I can even move this breakpoint a little bit further on. But the biggest thing is obviously if I try to voice the sound from here, it's not going to sound the same based on the fact that the MIDI note starts here. So I can't expect the synthesizer to produce exactly the same sound that it would based on the preset that I've used, based on the device parameters of my synthesizer. And that's why I would definitely say that freezing the track makes more sense. I've also implemented the tuner in this instance to actually pitch the oscillator of my wavetable synthesizer in key, so that when I'm actually descending in pitch, you can see it's moving from 0 all the way to minus 1199, which is a major third interval to the root in this instance. So I implemented a tuner just to be able to analyze that. But effectively what I could do now is I'm going to also make use of a compressor in the signal chain. And I'm just going to place the compressor and just control the dynamic range just a little. Oh, let's bring that down a little bit and dial in the attack and release time. You could also implement an auto release time if you're not 100% certain how your whether your release time is actually effective or not. The auto release time will actually analyze the audio passing through the compressor's signal chain. And now what I can do is, for the sake of immediacy, if I wanted to start a playback from here or here or here, based on the fact that this is a long sample being generated by the synthesizer, I could freeze the sound. So I can freeze the state of the synthesizer by right-clicking on the track and saying I would like to freeze it. It's now freezing the arrangement. And then all the pitch shift data, everything that I've done, will now be frozen to a new audio track, which means I could play it from here, or from here, or from here, which means I can scrub around and start playback anywhere without having to initiate that MIDI note every single time. So let's hear this in context to our the rest of our arrangement. So this is still a little bit in the background. I can definitely bring this up in the foreground a little bit more. You can see I've automated the volume fader of this alien sound. And I'm going to right click and say show automation. And I can simply correct this by dragging this in over here. So these particular MIDI notes that you heard from our tonal-based synthesizer, which is over here, this section with our operator synthesizer. So this is my frequency modulation synthesizer, or FM synth, entitled Operator. You will find that in the instrument section, by the way, over here. And this is just a preset called Unison Filter Velocity Lead that I've taken as a starting point and then started manipulating the various device parameters within our operator synthesizer. We will be discussing the operator in more detail in class next week. But effectively, you will hear that there are a whole bunch of notes being generated by the synth. Let's just hear them. So you could actually hear and see that these notes are starting exactly at keyframes. The stomp is my first note. And that's a little bit late, so I can actually adjust that. Let's find the actual point of impact. And you'll find that, sometimes your keyframes are not 100% always where you anticipate them to be. So let's find that keyframe. And I'm using my arrow buttons. And now we've pinpointed where that stomp should be. So that's going to be here. So now we can pull this back, align this, go back into the clip view, disable the actual clip. So, or not disable the clip, but disable the grid. Zoom in. Find that keyframe and drag and drop the MIDI note so that you are 100% on the money. Let's see it again. Let me just go back to my lead. I'm going to drag this back so that we can just keep this highlighted as I'm clicking here. There we go. So I'm using my spacebar to stop playback and restart playback based on where I've selected my playhead to be. So that's a really good way of demoing specific sounds. And let's say we wanted this to be an octave above as well, just to make it a little bit more impactful. I can unmute this. Okay, so this very ominous lead sound, and this is obviously very dry still, so we can process this. Let's use echo this time. So I'm making use of the echo audio effect. We can drag and drop this. This is just a standard tape echo. And I'm just going to make use of 2 time-based values in terms of milliseconds, just to create more of an immersive lead sound. Feedback around about 65%. Fairly dry still. And I'm going to just solo this so that we could hear this. So you could hear that it's a little bit more immersive. Let me make it a little bit more audible. So it's just a little bit more immersive based on the fact that there's something happening in terms of the sound, you know, not staying static. And that's very, very important to take into consideration. We could even play around with, let's say, the stereo spread. Perhaps the stereo spread could be automated to change through this musical phrase. So let's do that. That's the stereo spread that I'm looking at over here. So let's right click and say show automation. And let's start the stereo spread from here and have that kind of expand as we go on. So you could actually hear that, you know, it might sound slightly dissonant, but that also creates a lot more depth based on the fact that it is an ominous creature. We are generating a fairly tonal sound, but also yet with a whole bunch of additional harmonics. And that's what's so great about the FM synthesizer. We're utilizing a fundamental set of 4 operators that affect one another in terms of the harmonics that we are able to generate. And we'll explore that in more detail. But just explore a couple of videos. I'll share a couple of links, you know, when we actually do our lecture on frequency modulation synthesis next week. So now that I've got this, I'm going to make it a little bit less apparent in terms of the echo. And I'm also going to be making use of an additional compressor. So I could also make use of the glue compressor as an example. This is more of an analog styled compressor. Here's my threshold, there's my makeup gain, as well as the attack, release, and ratio. Let's bring the, I'm going to keep the ratio at 4. And I'm going to do some parallel compression. So I'm going to keep the dry sound coming through at about 53% wet. So we've got some of the dry signal coming through as well as the compressed signal. Let's bring this down. And implement some makeup gain. And that's now, you know, becoming a lot more apparent in terms of the texture. Remember, we could also work with a filter in this context. The echo also has a built-in reverb, by the way, if you wanted to make use of it. It also spread the stereo imaging a little bit. Remember, this reverb can also be a little bit abrasive based on the decay time, which is part of the reverb circuit over here. If this is set at 100%, it's going to start reverberating uncontrollably, so be aware of that. But we could also control the input signal and the output signal in terms of gain staging of the tape echo effect. But now we've got something quite musical, and let's hear what it sounds like in context to the track. So our synthesizer over here is still a little bit softer than our alien sound based on the fact that we've adjusted the volume over here. So I'm going to bring this up as well as the makeup gain over here. I'm probably going to add a little bit more wet signal as well. There's something else that I've noticed, and that is our second bunch of notes that we've created, or the second note that we've created here. Oh, there are 2 notes. Are slightly out of time in comparison to where the branch breaks. The branch breaks over here and not over there. So I'm going to be dragging this back. And I want to be 100% on the money so that we create more of an immersive interaction between the sound So I'm also extending my previous note. Let's see. So okay, so our alien sound is a little bit aggressive, and it's very easy for us to actually just unfreeze the track. We're not flattening it. If we unfreeze the track, then we can access either the volume of the synthesizer, which I'll probably do over here, or the output signal. I'm going to just drop the output signal just to be a little bit more in the background. And that brings me to discussing the behr rack. Before we do that, let's have a look at the white noise that I've also generated here. So you can actually hear that, you know, we've got our two filters being manipulated. Our first filter, we also have a built-in filter envelope, which obviously I've disabled. But we can implement an additional filter envelope if we wanted to create more complexity in terms of multiple elements modulating the filter cutoff frequency. We have one particular area where steam is coming out of the character's mouth. And then now it's descending. And we could obviously also have a look and see that we've got some compression that is compressed to the vocal sample. That is the choral sample that I've implemented with the instances of the simplers in this project. Just to be certain that when we generate this white noise, all of these elements of synthesizers, because we generate a drone over here during the scene, where our vocal simplers will then create the new musical motif that needs to be the focal point at that point in time. So I've implemented sidechain compression over here through my synthesized sound designed elements to make space for my vocal synthesizers that the simpler devices actually house, the vocal samples that the synthesizer, the simpler devices house as the focal point, and that the drone doesn't completely overpower the movement in terms of the musical idea over here. Now, I wanted to, let's explore this first, because obviously behr is introduced afterwards, and then I'm probably going to wrap this video up. But let's have a look and see at the this entire scene in action, and let's hear the drone and all the various elements of the synthesis. This is the drone of the wavetable synthesizer. So there we go. We've now implemented the behr rack. You can actually hear the vocal simplers in action. I could just play a snippet. I wanted to keep this fairly ethereal, where, things aren't as defined. So you could actually hear that a lot of the samples overlapping one another don't necessarily resolve 100% in terms of the musical idea. And that adds additional quality of an undefined nature. And that was done on purpose just to be able to create a little bit of uncertainty as this character is still trying to find out whether this creature is friendly, whether this creature is not going to do something out of the ordinary, or that could actually harm her. So I wanted to take that as a focal point and work with vocal samples to make it a little bit more human instead of synthesized elements. But we've processed this with additional echo. We've added additional reverb over here, but nothing is stopping you from exploring the rest of the sound library in terms of audio effects. There are a whole bunch of fantastic plugins that you can explore. And, the elements that I've pointed out are obviously just stock standard plugins that you can implement, but nothing is stopping you from, let's say, working with a corpus, So I could take the corpus effect and generate an additional tone with this effect. So let's hear what this sounds like. I'm just doing this off the top of my head. Let me just bring the volume down overall. So you can hear what the corpus is doing. It's actually taking a virtual body, like an acoustic guitar's sound source, the body of a hollow-bodied instrument, and generating a specific tone. And that tone could either be based on any of these various exciters that we could actually make use of. So it's going to sound different once we actually interface with the decay time, the material, and we are implementing additional textural elements through this virtual sound body that we can implement as an audio effect through the corpus audio effects instrument, or the audio effect rather. Okay, so I'm not going to be exploring this too much, but try and have a look at all the various possibilities in regards to audio effects, especially audio effects. MIDI effects, maybe not so much, but audio effects most definitely in this instance. So I'm going to keep this fairly dry. Just going to give it a little bit of an extra tone. And then let's have a look at our behr rack. And the behr rack, with every single tine, you can see I've created some markers over here. And then I can actually place them. And we could also take these various instances. I just wanted to show that these are all separate MIDI regions. And we can actually combine all of these once we've decided that we know the placement or like the placement of these markers and these MIDI notes. I could select all of them by selecting one clip at the top when you see the hand icon, and click, press the shift button and click, and then I could right click and say consolidate. The hotkey for that is Command J or Control J. And now that turns it into one particular MIDI clip region, and we could expand the length of these notes. We could obviously remove the fixed grid and expand the fixed grid. And if I wanted to repitch this, let's say an octave down, I could select all of it by pressing Command A or Control A to select all of these MIDI notes, and then keep Shift in and press the down arrow key to move it down by an octave. Let's hear that. Okay, so there's a specific click over here taking place when the behr actually switches into the reverse mode. You can see that I've actually mapped the reverse button on the behr rack with this dial over here. You could see off, on. But the way that I also managed to control the start point of the sample being played back in reverse is by utilizing the auxiliary envelope that's in the modulation section and the sample offset. So that is when the sample starts playing back. I mapped the peak to the same macro as the reverse switch. So the reverse switch's macro mapping setting, if I go to map mode, just to kind of give you an idea of how I did this, you can see that I mapped the reverse switch, which obviously has two states, 1 and 0, to the minimum range of 1, the maximum range of 0, and then the same macro mapping, or the same macro, has also got the peak mapped to it from 0% to around about 89%. Now, obviously, if we are reversing a sample once we've triggered this to actually go into reverse mode, let me just re-enable the automation over here. You'll hear that there's a little bit of a click taking place. Not necessarily. So that is due to the fact that this is starting halfway in terms of the sample being voiced. And we can alleviate that click sound by utilizing the attack amplitude envelope. And I can show the automation over here. And I can quickly just implement an attack time so that we can get rid of that click. There we go. So that is how I've utilized the Behr rack. I've also implemented some delay. I've disabled the arpeggiator for this example, but you can also make this a lot more interesting by, let's say, implementing our built-in oscillator within the sampler device. And that is the oscillator volume. I'm utilizing an FM oscillator, frequency modulation, and I've mapped the volume, which is this dial over here, to generate maybe more of an ethereal sound later on. I can actually, let's say, automate that, and then you'll hear what I mean when you see the playback over here. So that's obviously a lot more brash. I can bring this a little bit down. And that just generates additional harmonic content, you know, through the use of this frequency modulation oscillator. You know, but the idea really is to explore, you know, be comfortable and explore creating your keyframes and generate some sounds. And see whether you know, elements are translating together in time. Now I've taken the thematic concept with another behr over here, but I've decided against it, so I'm not actually making use of that. But let's have a look at the piano motif very briefly. I'm obviously going to be expanding on this idea, but the piano motif is kind of set to generate motion in the beginning, but also uncertainty in regards to the, you know, borrowing from both the major and the minor key of a specific key signature. Just with a standard little melody at the top. So you can hear that obviously I'm introducing the lower frequencies as a part of this anticipation once the character actually hears the rocks falling down and the debris. So I'm utilizing the theme and then trying to follow what is happening, you know, in terms of the context of the narrative of the video. So I've also echoed this ever so briefly or slightly with my pizzicato strings over here from this section. So let's hear this in context. This was a little bit soft in the beginning, but let's hear it from the beginning. So that section over here, I decided to do some octaves, but that just sounds really cheesy. So I've decided that what I can do is I can still keep it, but let's say lessen the amount of velocity of these particular higher frequency notes. So I can just bury it in the mix. So you could still hear it building up, but it's not as apparent. So sometimes you might have an interesting musical idea, but it just doesn't translate well. Sometimes you could just finesse the amount of velocity to dial it in and get something that is more usable. So instead of getting rid of something that you feel doesn't work, just refine it until you actually find something that works very well. So that wraps up the video. I hope this was very informative. I look forward to looking at your projects and listening to your compositions and seeing your sound design and Foley in place. I will be uploading a folder with a whole bunch of found sound effects that you can incorporate in your project. But remember, be original. Try and change these sounds. Try and produce around them utilizing audio effects and so on. But I hope this was informative, and please let me know if you have any questions. And I look forward to seeing your projects. Thanks a lot. Cheers.